It took only a short while for the alliance to mobilize its forces, and following Cui Chenyo's orders and the pounding war drums, the alliance army began to converge. Kyle, great general, has come to the front line to oversee the battle. Those who retreat will be executed. What? How could it be like this? The majesties are already angry, and they're using the scarlet gold drums to push us on. We either kill them all or die ourselves. It's all or nothing. With so many of us, there's no way we can't win. Let's go. The urgent pounding of the drums made everyone panic. Before the war, the alliance members had convened and decided that war drums would be used as signals, in addition establishing the way they would be used. The war drums were divided into many types, and the scarlet gold drums were one type. The pounding of these drums had a metallic timbre. Once these drums began to thunder, if the walls were not broken through in a certain amount of time, all the soldiers and generals would be executed. With the cold wave coming, the only chance of survival lay in occupying the Great Tang. In order to reach this goal, the countries were willing to pay any price. Kill! With a furious roar, the countless red-eyed alliance soldiers charged at the Tang force from all sides. Forward was death, and retreat was also death. Compared to being cut down by one's own people, it was better to fight to the death with the foe. Moreover, everyone could sense that the turning of the hell will had grown unstable. These heavy infantry were not as powerful as they once were. It was now more possible to contend against them. But though these soldiers charged out, they were not the first to attack. Rumble. The earth began to tremble as large silhouettes blotted out the sky. One of the alliance soldiers at the very front looked up and saw an enormous structure overhead, and he shouted in excitement, "Siege towers! It's the siege towers!" As if in response to this soldier's shout, atop the siege tower, soldiers with broad backs and wide shoulders knocked arrows to their bows, pulled the strings back, and took aim at the heavy infantry. Swish! One of the master archers released, and the arrow streaked through the air. As a heavy infantry soldier began to move, an arrow pierced through a chink in his armor right beneath his neck, punching through his neck and out his back. Not even the heavy infantryman's thick stellar energy had been able to stop it. Armor-piercing arrows. Condor snipers. The soldiers gathered on the walls of the steel fortress grimaced. Those archers atop the siege towers were not using ordinary arrows, but armor-piercing arrows. This was the only way for the arrows to have penetrated through the stellar energy barrier and through the helmet and the armor at the back. Ordinary master archers did not have such strength and accuracy. These could only be the Condor snipers of Goguryeo. Goguryeo infantry couldn't match the Great Tang, and its cavalry couldn't match the Eastern Turks, let alone Arabia. But if there was one aspect in which Goguryeo surpassed all the other countries, it was in the Condor snipers. The most elite master archers were the Condor snipers. It was said that Condor snipers could accurately shoot out the eyes of a gerfalcon in the air, leaving the plumage untouched. They could accurately strike certain muscles of a gerfalcon to make them lose balance and fall from the sky, allowing the gerfalcons to be captured. In the Goguryeo, the saying went 3 eagles with 1 arrow, even 4 eagles with 1 arrow. The best of the Condor snipers didn't just know how to find the right angles. They could lead the target, which led them to be able to take down several eagles with 1 arrow. What seemed like fantastical archery truly existed in Goguryeo. Moreover, Goguryeo had maintained a tradition of selecting astonishingly talented children and training them when they were only 4 or 5 years old. These children had to loose arrows 10,000 times a day, and by the time they were adults, they had to do it 1 million times. No ordinary master archers could reach this level. Thwish, thwish, thwish. This 1 arrow was a sort of signal, and with a piercing whistle, the 10-some Condor snipers atop the siege tower loosed their arrows in unison, unleashing a volley of death. Thud, thud, thud. Heavy infantry dropped to the ground without making a sound, their bodies nailed to the ground by the armor-piercing arrows. With a great rumble, even more siege towers arrived on the battlefield. Wang Chong blinked as he suddenly ordered, "Chun Burang, suppress the Condor snipers. Su Hanshan, assist him. Tell the soldiers on the front line that they can retreat now." The 40,000 heavy infantry had killed more than 200,000 enemy soldiers, broken in Lushan's underworld cavalry, and dealt a heavy blow to the enemy morale. There was no need to keep on fighting. From Wang Chong's position, he could see that the elite armies of the alliance were converging. While the Hell Will formation was formidable, it was not enough for one to go against 10,000, for 40,000 to directly challenge the entirety of the alliance army. Moreover, war was not a game. Though the 40,000 soldiers had vanquished their foe, it had come at the heavy cost of 10,000 losses. When only 27,000 soldiers were left, the Hell Will formation could no longer be maintained. And this was only because Wang Chong had modified the formation. Thwish thwish thwish. Following Wang Chong's order, the shrieking volley of arrows changed direction and began to head toward the Gogurian Condor snipers on the siege towers. Defend! Gogurians cried out. Even the Condor snipers needed to take countermeasures against this carpet of arrows. But the Condor snipers atop the siege towers were unruffled, and everyone soon discovered why. Boom! Boom! Gears clunked and rumbled, and soon, a metal plate sprang out from the top of the siege tower and blocked the arrows. The front of the plate was covered in numerous inscriptions that were clearly meant to strengthen its defenses. Clang clang clang. The sharp arrowheads pierced nearly 1 foot into the steel plate. A single steel plate was pincushioned by hundreds of arrows, but in the end, the steel plate held fast. A team of Condor snipers sniggered at this sight. The Great Tang was underestimating them too much. This was not some mob that had gathered impromptu to assault a city. They had already constructed the siege towers, so how could they not have taken precautions against this sort of attack? The master archers in the fortress could not threaten them. But as these thoughts passed through their minds, plush plush plush, blood spurted out. 5 Condor snipers who had just been preparing to return fire were suddenly pierced through by sharp arrows. These arrows had been imbued with stellar energy and had shattered their spines and important meridians. How could this be? They widened their eyes in disbelief as they toppled over. They had never imagined that they would still be hit despite the steel plate protecting their front. Ah! Screams came from a nearby siege tower. It was clear that they were not the only Condor snipers suffering from this fatal volley. Watch out! Sun archers! The captain of the Condor sniper team called out in alarm, his voice twisted from fear. Condor snipers was merely what foreign countries called them. This title did not exist within Goguryeo. Rather, archers were divided into the categories of sun, moon, and star. Ordinary archers didn't have the right to be ranked. Meanwhile, those master archers who could hit a tree from 100 li away were known as star archers. Top-class master archers, the ones the other countries called Condor snipers, were considered moon archers in Goguryeo. As for sun archers, they were extremely rare in Goguryeo. Only the very best Condor snipers could earn this title. All the Condor snipers were suddenly in grave danger, and the earth rumbled as some of the siege towers began to retreat in panic. But things were far from over. Boom! With a heaven-shaking rumble, one of the siege towers suddenly collapsed, half of the roof crashing straight into the ground. Giant ballistae! Careful! Cries of alarm came from all sides. The siege towers all felt greatly threatened and began to retreat. Destroying a siege tower was no easy task. They were not made of simple wood, but had been further reinforced with many steel plates. This was why they did not fear ordinary ballistae. The size of the siege towers made the pinprick attacks from the ballistae incapable of affecting the siege tower's purpose. But giant ballistae were different. They represented the sole threat to the siege towers on this battlefield. Bang! Another boom rang out as the second siege tower exploded. The giant ballistae were capable of killing behemoths, making them the perfect weapon against siege towers. The attack of the giant ballista bolts forced the siege towers to pull back, and the siege towers that had yet to arrive at the front were also escorted away. Thwish thwish thwish. Without the threat of the siege towers, the master archers on the walls once more aimed their volleys down below, and the soldiers of the alliance screamed as they were cut down. All soldiers retreat! Under the cover of the arrows, the remaining less than 30,000 infantry began an orderly retreat. Though their formation was on the verge of collapsing, the heavy infantry maintained a high degree of discipline. Bang! With a metallic clatter, the large gate of the steel fortress was lifted. The formation broke apart as the heavy infantry split up into neat ranks and safely withdrew into the fortress. Boom! The steel gate was allowed to drop back down, gears turning once more. No Tang soldiers remained outside the walls. Once the rumbling had faded away, the battlefield suddenly fell silent. All soldiers, slow the assault, Cui Qianyu immediately ordered, his eyes flashing. Now that the Tang infantry had retreated, there was no meaning in chasing them. They still had many matters to handle, including consolidating the army and attacking the city. Following Cui Qianyu's order, the army's speed slowed down significantly. Now comes the true defense. The Crown Prince's junior guardian surveyed the field of corpses and debris and sighed. War was always cruel. In this battle, the Alliance had left more than 200,000 corpses on the field, while the Great Tang had left almost 10,000. This was one of the cruelties of war. Even though they had won an overwhelming victory, it had not come for free. But Wang Zhongxi didn't have time for these things. The battle just now was a warm-up, and the next battles would be even crueler. As one of the commanders of this army, he needed to ready himself. Wang Zhongxi quickly turned around and left. Meanwhile, Wang Chong gave a slight nod and quickly turned his attention to the battlefield beyond the walls. The Alliance had no intent of retreating. It took only a few minutes for a new development to occur. Rumble. With the sound of rolling wheels, the vast army outside the walls parted, allowing small carts piled with large rocks to arrive at the front. Bang! The small carts dumped their loads into the long moat of spikes. Thud, thud, thud. Thousands of stones rolled into the moat. It's the catapults from the rear. They're bringing their stone piles up to the front. The Tongluo Great General suddenly said, his expression grim. Catapults did not travel alone. They also came with numerous small carts that would carry the stones that they threw. The Alliance had realized that the catapults were easily blocked by the master archers on the walls, which ruined the plan to use the catapults to fill the moat, or at least made it much less efficient. Thus, they had just pushed up the stone carts to the front line to dump the rocks into the moat. Nay! But this was only the beginning. The neighing of horses came from the Alliance army, and a few moments later, several Eastern Turkic cavalry appeared, dragging along a giant chain between them that was weighed down by a rock in the center. With this chain, the war horses were able to push a large number of corpses into the moat. A great crashing and crunching could be heard, and in the blink of an eye, almost half of the moat was filled. Even Wuxia was taken aback by this sight. Using corpses to fill a moat truly was a highly efficient method, but it was a little callous. And more than half of the corpses on the battlefield were theirs. Should we stop it? Wuxia turned to Wang Chong. The enemy commander was much more cold-hearted than anticipated, capable of resorting to any method to reach their goal. If this continued, the moat would soon cease to exist. There's no need. Wang Chong shook his head, his voice cold and aloof. The moment the moat was exposed, it was bound to be filled in. Let them. The heavy infantry had brought back most of the bodies of their comrades as they retreated. The remaining bodies outside belonged to the Alliance, and if they wanted to use this method to fill the moat, Wang Chong couldn't stop it. And this would be meaningless in any case. Pass on my order. The assault is about to begin. All soldiers, prepare for battle, Wang Chong indifferently said. As more and more corpses were pushed in, the long moat was filled in at an astonishing rate. My lord! On the other side of the battlefield, an Eastern Turkic officer was somewhat unable to bear this and instinctively turned to Great General Tai Chi Bilili. The Eastern Turkic Khaganate had brought the greatest number of soldiers, were skilled in archery and riding, were the ones doing this job, and more importantly, many of these bodies were Eastern Turkic soldiers. Let him be! Tai Chi Bilili's eyes flashed for a moment, but his face quickly turned hard and cold. I just received a report that the area 500 some li to the south of Chita, the largest pasture of the Khaganate, has been completely sealed in ice. We no longer have any place to pasture our herds, and we've already butchered too many cows and sheep. It won't be long before we won't have any left, and we will no longer be able to return to the steppe. Our most urgent priority is to destroy the Great Tang and occupy its lands. This is the only way we can survive. In comparison, these corpses don't matter. As a nomadic civilization, the Eastern Turkic Khaganate had its own understandings and its own ceremonies. This sort of burial was a sort of humiliation, but that was then and this was now. There was no longer time to worry about such things. A few moments later, a Turkic horseman rode out of the snow and appeared in front of Taichi Bililai. "Great General, we've finished filling in the moat." Taichi Bililai blinked as he came back to his senses. "Hear my order. Prepare to assault the city." Boom! A horn blared, and the war drums thundered. The Alliance army picked up speed as it prepared to assault the city. Even though the underworld cavalry had been lost in the earlier battle, the Alliance army had yet to suffer a serious wound. The only problem was that the 40,000 heavy infantry had worked their way around the defense line and had destroyed more than 10,000 shield carts. This had been the greatest loss to the Alliance army. But the Alliance had made ample preparations for this war, and the 40,000 Tang infantry had only destroyed the wheels and hubs of the shield carts. The frontal steel plates, reinforced by inscriptions and formations, were not so easy to destroy. Rumble. 3,000 feet away from the walls, an icy mist surged as the Alliance army reconsolidated and formed its defense line. Tens of thousands of shield carts formed the front line, with soldiers carrying large shields and the siege towers behind them. The elite cavalry of the Alliance, including the Golden Wolf cavalry and the Wando army, remained in the rear, and behind them were Tian Shenzhen, Taichi Bililai, and King Bujin. All of the army began to steadily advance. Kill! With mighty war cries, the Alliance army quickly crossed the moat. This time, even though there were no obstructions, the Alliance army was much more cautious. Gallop! At the same time, around 600 warhorses in thick armor that covered everything except their eyes dragged large stones in the direction of the steel fortress. Humph! They've learned. On the high walls, Wang Chong coldly sneered before falling silent once more. After suffering a loss, the Alliance had learned. They were using warhorses to scout the path and had covered the horses with armor to prevent them from being shot. As for the large stones they dragged, they could trigger any buried traps. Thwish, thwish, thwish. Arrows shrieked through the air in volley after volley. After several volleys, the warhorses were ultimately killed despite their armor. Only a few managed to reach the walls, but they were shot down all the same. It's fine. Cui Qianyu had been observing this process, and his eyes flashed as he waved his hand and ordered the army to continue advancing. Although the warhorses had been killed, he had obtained the information he wanted. It appeared that there were no other traps besides the moat. Bang! Following Cui Qianyu's order, the Alliance army bellowed and advanced at full speed, casting aside their caution. 2,600 feet, 1,200 feet, 400 feet. The distance had now shrunk enough to the point where there was no going back. The soldiers madly charged forward, the ones at the very front gripping the ropes on their waists that they would use to climb the walls. The battle was imminent, and everyone's hearts hung with suspense. The shield soldiers raised up their heavy shields to create a giant shield canopy that the Alliance soldiers could pass under. As for the siege towers, Cui Qianyu had left these valuable siege weapons for the very end. The threat of the giant ballistae was just too great. Meanwhile, tens of thousands of siege ladders were carried by the soldiers to the steel walls. At this time, the Alliance army was set on assaulting the city. The shield carts and shield soldiers served as the defense while the ropes and siege ladders would give them access to the walls. Once the battle began, the siege towers would come forward, bringing even more soldiers to the walls, increasing the pressure on the fortress. After this, they would think of some way to open the gate so that they could charge inside, and after that would be the battle that would decide the fate of the Alliance and the Great Tang. They had played out this scenario countless times, and the losses were definitely controllable. Something's not right. Upon seeing that the army was about to reach the walls, Tian Xianxia, another one of Yozhou's great generals, frowned in unease. Quiet. Too quiet. In the previous battle, the Great Tang had used a hidden moat and 40,000 soldiers who had been so aggressive that they had only retreated after they had been almost exhausted. But now the army was almost at the walls, yet there had been no response from the fortress. This was far too abnormal. Military advisor Gao Shang was also uneasy. Although he wasn't a battlefield general, he could tell that this silence was abnormal. But at this stage in the battle, Gao Shang was incapable of intervening. What is this bastard up to? And Lu Shan clenched his fists, his expression grim. He was sure that Wang Chong had some sort of scheme, but he didn't know what it was. This sort of feeling was extremely uncomfortable. 200 feet. 100 feet. It was less than 30 meters to the wall now, and the alliance was on the verge of reaching its objective. But for some reason, whether it was Tian Qianjin, Taichi Bililai, Cui Qianyu, Yun Geisemin, or in Lushan, all of them felt an extreme unease that prevented them from smiling. Wang Chong was the renowned war saint, a true master of military strategy. The quieter it was, the more dangerous. In a certain way, this tension and unease began to influence the soldiers at the very front. Bang! In the midst of this eerie silence, a great boom came from the depths of the steel fortress. With a piercing whistle, a giant silhouette streaked with faint wisps of flame crashed down from the heavens. With a boom, the black object crashed into the dense ranks of the Alliance army and exploded into a ball of raging flame. Ah! At the center of the explosion, several Alliance soldiers were splashed by some black substance and then ignited into balls of flame. Kerosene! A plaintive scream tore through the air, shattering the silence. A moment later, bang! 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 One giant kerosene bomb, after another, flew over the steel walls and crashed into the army. Resounding explosions rang out, and in a few moments, the battle front had been turned into a sea of fire. After Wang Chong had defeated the Arab army in the northwest, an important reason for his conquest of the rest of the Arabian Empire was the kerosene possessed by Arabia. Gao Xianji and Insishan were not garrisoned in Baghdad purely to pacify rebels. Another important purpose was to organize the people of the Arabian Empire into extracting kerosene. The amount of kerosene and the speed at which it was extracted was far from what Wang Chong had desired, but that was because Wang Chong's requirements had been very high. The Arabian Empire had produced significant amounts of kerosene, and all of it had been sent to the Great Tang. Some of it had been sent to various areas for heating, but a significant portion had also been sent to the forward base, where they had been formed into these kerosene bombs. Wang Chong had waited until now to use them in this battle, right when the dense ranks of the Alliance army were right up to the walls. Boom boom boom. When Wang Chong made his move, he did so with maximum saturation. Thousands of kerosene bombs crashed down and exploded in the ranks of the Alliance army. The area for several thousand feet in front of the steel fortress was drenched in kerosene. Even the shield carts and raised shields, and all of it was set aflame. Smoke and flames rose more than 10 meters into the air in a shocking sight. The northeast had been cold and frozen, but now all the chill had been swept away, leaving only roiling waves of heat. Snowflakes drifted down and melted into water, and when this water entered the kerosene, the flames burned even more fiercely. "Watch out!" a Turkic general cried out, but he was too late. The moment the soldiers reached the walls, Wang Chong had never thought about giving them a chance to escape. Dying screams could be heard through the black smoke, and the stench of burning flesh and skin filled the air. The high temperatures even made the shield carts turn bright red, the inscriptions and formations beginning to melt. As for the losses, they were innumerable, and Lu Shan and Yun Geisemin instantly paled at this sight. The orderly and somber ranks of the Alliance army had instantly been turned into a hellish landscape. This madman! And Lu Shan cursed, his eyes flying open. Wang Chong loved the people of the Great Tang like they were his own children, and he had a virtuous reputation that no one could match, many people even revering him as a sage. But to the other countries, Wang Chong had nothing to do with the word virtue. His actions and methods were those of a complete devil. No, not even a devil could perpetrate such cruel acts. Not only was this sea of fire created by kerosene difficult to extinguish, the melting snow carried the kerosene with it and spread the fire. A general of average height, surrounded by a storm of energy, swiftly shouted an order. "Sandbags! Sandbags. If one looked carefully, one would notice that this man wore 5 long sabers on his back. This was none other than the Brigadier General of Goguryeo, King Bujin. The army swiftly took action, the Gogurian soldiers rushing up with packed cloth bags. These cloth bags were rapidly delivered to the front line. Bang! A Gogurian soldier heaved the cloth bag on his shoulder into the sea of fire. The flames burned away the cloth, revealing large amounts of sea sand. In this alliance, each country had a specific job. When assaulting a city, one of the most common defenses was attack by fire. The task of dealing with this had been left to Goguryeo. Goguryeo and the Great Tang had fought for many years in close battles, so the Gogurians were extremely experienced. King Bujin had even sent up a division of the army specifically for putting out fires. These cloth bags contained coarse sand extracted from the shores of the Goguryeo Empire and were excellent for putting out flames. King Bujin had planned on using this sand to fill in the moat, but the situation on the battlefield was constantly shifting, and the Great Tang had given him no chance. The 40,000 heavy infantry in their Hell Will formation had already crossed the moat and plunged into the Alliance army. As for later, considering that they might have needed to use the sand to put out flames, King Bujin had decided to let Cui Qianyu use corpses to fill up the moat. Thud thud thud. As the bags were thrown into the fire, the flames were finally suppressed. But extinguishing the flames entirely was a much more difficult task. Before this battle, the Gogurians had never imagined that they would be facing Arabian kerosene. This sea sand was much less effective than expected. This man was truly frightening. It was fortunate that Zhang Shogui had been overseeing Anong. Not him. As King Bujun looked at the distant walls, he felt his heart thump in fear. There were many ways a soldier could die on the battlefield, but being burned to death by kerosene was one of the cruelest. The Great Tang's king of foreign lands was far crueler and more frightening than they had imagined. The Goguryeo Empire had always considered itself unlucky that it was located on a peninsula, restricted no matter in what direction it tried to expand. Moreover, the powerful Anong Protector General Zhang Shogui of the Great Tang Empire had left the Goguryeo Empire bound to its current territory for decades. But now, King Bujin counted himself lucky that it had been Zhang Shogui. If not, he might have had to face the great demon king that was Wang Chong. This man's methods and style would have left Goguryeo utterly ruined. As these thoughts ran through his mind, King Bujin suddenly heard a scream of terror from the distance. King Bujin instinctively turned to look, and the sight made this renowned general of Goguryeo shiver in fear. Bang! With a massive boom, a giant steel ball hurtled out of the air. No, this was not some simple metal ball, but a giant caltrop that was as tall as 4 people. The caltrop was covered in sharp spikes that were 6 to 7 feet long, the tips gleaming with a frightening light. Swoosh swoosh swoosh. When the caltrop dropped to the ground, the spikes stabbed through the bodies of Alliance soldiers, carrying them along as it rolled across the ground. The Alliance soldiers all possessed above-average cultivation. In normal circumstances, they should not have been so easy to kill. But no matter how much stellar energy they had, they were nothing in front of this weighty caltrop and its sharp spikes, further bolstered by the power of gravity. Ah! Screams tore through the air as the giant caltrop rolled forward, carried by its immense inertia. On the crowded battlefield, there was no space for the soldiers to dodge. In just a few moments, the caltrop had pierced through numerous Alliance soldiers and ended their lives. As the caltrop rolled, it left a long and bloody path through the army. Release! 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 Orders came from inside the fortress, and steel clattered and gears groaned. One giant caltrop after another arced through the air and crashed outside the fortress. The dense ranks of the Alliance army instantly became a killing zone, with one of the caltrops even smashing into the Goguryeo soldiers transporting sand. Screams erupted as hundreds of Gogurian soldiers were crushed like ants beneath the giant caltrop. They unleashed their stellar energies and hacked at the caltrops with their weapons to stop them, but their resistance was futile. Retreat! King Bujin instantly paled. The division transporting sand was not made of elites, so how could they stop these things? On the walls, whether it was the aloof Su Hanshan or Chen Burang and Sun Jiming, All of them were relieved to hear the screams down below. And Lushan and his allies harbored ill ambitions. If they were allowed to enter the interior, countless common folk would suffer from disaster. They would never hold any pity for enemies. The kerosene bombs and giant caltrops instantly rendered the area in front of the fortress into a forbidden zone. Release! From the distant ranks of the Alliance army, an order was shouted, and then the air howled as a massive boulder wreathed in destructive force hurtled toward the walls. One boulder, 2, 3. Hundreds of catapults were unleashed, aimed at the areas the kerosene bombs and caltrops were coming from. Only catapults could deal with catapults. In the face of the Great Tang's fierce offensive, the Alliance immediately used their own catapults to retaliate. The Alliance had its catapults, and so did Wang Chong. But unlike the Alliance, Wang Chong's catapults were the metal catapults once used by Arabia. The only difference was that the Arabs had used the metal catapults to fling giants while Wang Chong had modified them to throw giant caltrops. The catapults could throw heavy things a very long distance, but there was a long interval between firing times, a critical flaw. However, Wang Chong's metal catapults had special mechanisms that shortened the firing interval, even though they were launching caltrops that each weighed several tons. Pass on my order. Have the Condor snipers and master archers on the forward siege towers aim at the kerosene bombs. Detonate them at a distance of 1,000 feet or more. Beneath the 6 banners of the Alliance, Gao Shang put away his folding fan, a sharp light in his eyes as he spoke. Nearby, a Gogrian general was taken aback and instinctively turned to Gogrian Emperor Yun Geiseman. The Condor snipers on the siege towers were their men. What right did an advisor from Yuzhou have to order them around? Didn't you hear? Go! Yun Geiseman said without even turning his head. Yes. The general felt his heart chill as he dropped his head and ran off. For this battle, let my men handle it. The Khitan king spoke up in a gruff voice, plucking at his thick beard as he surveyed the battlefield. My sons are the bravest. While you might be afraid of flames, we are not. The Khitan king's words made everyone fall silent, everyone looking at this rather special-looking Khitan king with strange looks. Xianxia was particularly taken aback, barely able to say a word. This was kerosene that both water and sand found hard to extinguish. The Yuzhou cavalry were brave, but not even they dared to charge in. Ha ha ha, the Khitan king is truly fierce and courageous. Since that is so, then I must trouble you. And Lushan heartily laughed, choosing to believe in the Khitan king. With a laugh, the Khitan king turned and left to make arrangements. A string of orders swiftly began to shift around the battlefield. Kaklak. Atop the siege towers, the Gogrian Condor snipers pulled back their bowstrings and took aim at the sky. Boom! With deafening howls, countless arrows shot out of the siege towers and collided against a kerosene bomb. Thud thud thud. The kerosene bombs began to explode more than 1,000 feet in the air. The detonation of one kerosene bomb even managed to trigger a chain explosion with the waves of heat and flames it unleashed. No ordinary master archer could have so accurately calculated the trajectory of the kerosene bombs and detonated them more than 1,000 feet in the air, but this was as normal as breathing for the Condor snipers. The scattering and explosion of kerosene would normally only add to the flames and create even more damage. But this was why Gao Shang had required the kerosene bombs to be detonated more than 1,000 feet in the air. This would allow all the kerosene to burn out in the air so that it would present no threat on the ground. Whoosh! As the kerosene bombs exploded, a blazing sea of fire appeared in the cold skies, a red light plating the clouds in a glorious sight. Wang Chong looked up at the blazing clouds and slightly frowned. Gao Shang. A thought flashed through Wang Chong's mind. The Alliance had many experts, and Lushan, Gao Shang, Cui Qinyu, Taichi Bililai, and Yun Geiseman. They were all mighty powerhouses that excelled in both judgment and strategy. Defeating them was no easy task. But the more this was the case, the more determined Wang Chong was to break them. Humph! Petty tricks. Wang Chong coldly laughed and quickly regained his composure. The battle had only just begun, but the Alliance had already lost numerous people without even climbing the walls. If you really think that working together would be enough to defeat the Great Tang, you're too naive. Meanwhile, with the assistance from the archers on the siege towers, the pressure on the alliance was greatly reduced. Even so, the sea of fire in front of the fortress presented a formidable barrier to the alliance army. If they did not find a way to extinguish the flames, they still would not be able to assault the fortress. "Stand aside!" At this moment, gruff shouts came from the rear. Boom! A giant tree trunk flew out from the army and crashed into the sea of fire. The tree trunk was covered in black kerosene and began to burn. But at this moment, clap, a foot stomped onto the thick trunk. At the same time, a chitin warrior, his hair tied into braids, began to walk across the burning trunk, holding a tree trunk under each arm. Thud! Thud! The two tree trunks were also tossed into the sea of flame, the three tree trunks together forming a path through the sea of fire. "Let me!" A chitin warrior with bronze eyes, his body radiating fighting intent, charged like a bull into the sea of flames, also carrying two trunks under his arms. The blazing flames scorched the man, but neither this man nor the previous chitin warrior seemed to notice, not even caring about the smell of burning flesh coming from their bodies. Thump thump, more and more aggressive chitin warriors, their bodies covered in wolfskin, began to charge in, throwing giant logs into the sea of fire and creating temporary paths across the flames. Ah! Suddenly, one of the chitin warriors fell into the sea of fire and was soon set aflame, but the other chitin warriors seemed to not see, not even frowning as they charged forward. This sort of courage was truly astonishing. The chitin tribe controlled a small territory and was located between various other countries, but through brute strength, they had carved out their own land and held out against the attacks of other countries. Even though Anong Protector General Zhang Shogui had tried many times to defeat them, he had been defeated each time, suffering significant losses with each attempt. Through this, one could see the ferocity of the chitins. But 100 rumors did not compare to a single meeting. At this moment, everyone could once more understand just how frightening the chitins were. Atop his horse, King Bujin realized what was going on, and his expression turned harsh as he began to issue orders. "Go! All soldiers, hurry and put on sand. Anyone who has carried less than 8 bags of sand in 5 minutes will be executed." He now understood that these fearless chitin warriors were braving the flames to create a path through the sea of fire to the walls of the fortress. The tree trunks were easy to burn, and using this method could only temporarily avoid the sea of flames to create a path. One would still be scorched by the heat, and the trunks would be quickly burned up. These paths would not last for long. The other soldiers of the Alliance could not use this method, as it would be no different from suicide. But if it was the chitins, that was another matter entirely. Use steel plates to help them create a path. The others also began to realize what was going on. In the earlier battle, many shield carts had been destroyed. Now, numerous Alliance soldiers worked together to push these destroyed shield carts into the sea of flames to help the chitins open a path. Clang! 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 Thousands of shield carts were cast into the sea of flames. With the help of the Alliance warriors, the force of the fire finally began to weaken, and the path of tree trunks extended all the way to the wall. "Go!" With a sharp bellow, the tens of thousands of chitin soldiers crossed the path made of more than 100 tree trunks. Even more astonishing was that while the first wave of chitins crossed the path barefoot, those behind them rode atop horses. The round trunks were very unstable, and it would be very easy for horses to misstep or make the logs shift. But the chitin cavalry seemed to be riding across level ground, displaying their masterful horsemanship. Besides one or two who accidentally fell into the flames, the other riders crossed smoothly. With the thundering of hooves, thousands of chitin warriors gathered beneath the walls. Clang! A moment later, these bright-eyed chitin warriors took out ropes that they flung up the walls. Sharp hooks attached to ropes that had been reinforced with steel wire flew up and latched onto the top of the walls. The chitin warriors swiftly began to climb the ropes, holding their weapons in their mouths as they agilely scaled the walls like monkeys. This agility and speed left all the other Alliance soldiers in the dust. The chitins lived in the forests of the snowy plains. They were extremely resistant to cold and used to living amongst the trees. Though the chitins were few in number, They were a most ferocious people. Climbing trees was a basic skill for them, and though the walls of the fortress were smooth, they were little different from trees to the chitons. Swoosh, swoosh, swoosh. The tree trunks were still burning, but the chitons had already scaled the walls, the ones at the front no more than 10 some meters from the top. With one lunge, they would be done. This astonishing sight made the eyes of the other Alliance soldiers fly open, but it also filled them with excitement. Chitons! 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 The cheers resounded through the world. The chitons had brought more than 100,000 warriors to the Alliance, more than enough to take the walls. Rumble! Under the encouragement of a group of chiton warriors, the siege towers began to slowly make their way toward the fortress. The Alliance soldiers rallied, excitedly roaring as they rushed forward with their siege ladders. The chitons are truly fierce and brave. In the rear, and Lu Shan couldn't help but laugh at the sight. Cui Qianyu and Tian Qianjin also couldn't hide their surprise. Once these chitons got serious, their ferocity was truly shocking. It seemed that not even death could stop them. For the Alliance army to have such a powerful ally was undoubtedly a blessing. The chiton king proudly laughed and said no more. The chitons lived in a much harsher environment than the other countries. If they were not so fierce, how could they contend with their foes? The chitons continued their rapid advance, and in short order, 7,000 to 8,000 chitons had gathered in front of the walls, and more chitons were continuing to ride across the sea of fire. Encouraged by the chitons, the other Alliance soldiers bellowed. Using shield carts and sand, they opened up more paths leading to the base of the walls. The catapult teams in particular had been inspired by the chitons, and they launched their boulders into the sea of fire to create paths. Completely extinguishing such a vast sea of fire was not something done quickly. But creating paths for the soldiers to advance was not as complicated. Thud! 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 Large boulders crashed into the sea of flames, and compared to the blazing tree trunks, these rocks were much easier to cross. Bang! A giant boulder rolled several dozen feet through the flames. A moment later, a long siege ladder descended, one part of the ladder happening to hook itself onto the top of the boulder, locking the ladder in place. Just like that, a suspended passage appeared. Kill! Alliance soldiers quickly began to climb up this passage. Whoosh! At the same time, a shovel dug into the dirt, lifting up the hot soil and burning kerosene and flinging them to the sides. Tens of thousands of Alliance soldiers at the edges of the army began to do this, using this crude but effective method to open up another path through the flames. With thousands of soldiers working together, a path 10 some meters wide was quickly dug through the sea of flames, and it rapidly crept toward the walls. The sight of tens of thousands of soldiers working together was truly a wondrous sight. The Great Tang had its plans, and so did the Alliance. And the Alliance was swiftly putting these countermeasures on display. Although the speed was relatively slow, it would take 10 minutes at most for the army to reach the wall. Whoosh! In the distance, the chiton warriors at the very front jumped, mounting the wall. Ha ha! Come and fight me! I'm going to kill all you Tang dogs! A chiton warrior heartily laughed, already prepared for a tough battle. But all that came in response was the twang of a bowstring. Whoosh! A sharp arrow punched through his throat, carrying with it a geyser of blood as it emerged from the back of his neck. The chiton warrior's eyes flew open in disbelief as he held his neck. Staggering backward as blood flowed out of the hole, he fell from the walls and into the flames. Kill them! Leave not one alive! Chun Burang coldly ordered, knocking another arrow to his bow and shooting down another chiton warrior. In this short while, Chun Burang had already ordered the master archers to withdraw from the walls, putting them out of range of the condor snipers on the siege towers. Without vision, even the condor snipers could not easily threaten his master archer unit. Activate the second defense line, Chun Burang immediately ordered. Creak creak. As Chun Burang spoke, the groaning of gears resounded over the battlefield. The soldiers scaling the walls of the fortress heard this terrifying sound and instinctively turned their heads in its direction. Look over there! Careful! What they saw made their hearts grow cold with fear. The smooth surfaces of the steel wall began to shift, numerous beehive-like holes appearing on them. These holes were arranged in columns and rows, densely distributed across the walls. It's beehives. Retreat, retreat! Fearful cries rang out across the battlefield. Wang Chong had 4 lethal weapons under his command, and they would always appear in each of his battles. The impregnable steel defense line, the reaping ballista army, the supreme Wuxian cavalry, and finally, his unique creations, famed for their ability to slaughter dense concentrations of enemy soldiers, the beehives. Amongst the mechanical weapons, only the beehives had yet to make an appearance. The beehives had the least killing power of the 4 weapons, and it had been a very long time since they had last appeared, but for ordinary soldiers, their concentrated fire was still a nightmare to deal with. No one had expected Wang Chong to wait until now to use this unique weapon. Moreover, these beehives were angled so that the bolts would cover more than half of the battlefield. What are you afraid of? I'll destroy them. Everyone, come with me. Khitans feel no fear. Charge! But in the face of this danger, the Khitan warriors did not retreat in fear. On the contrary, their bodies erupted with powerful fighting intent. Khitans felt no fear. This was the highest principle that all Khitans adhered to, the foundation behind their ability to resist all the other countries. As the beehives slowly appeared along the walls, none of the Khitans retreated. On the contrary, they rode toward the walls at an even faster pace. Roar! As they charged at the walls, the Khitan warriors roared, their dantians unleashing stellar energy that transformed into barriers and enclosed their surroundings. Some of the Khitan warriors were able to compress their stellar energy into frontal shields. Although the Khitan tribe had far fewer warriors than the other countries, the strength of their soldiers was much greater. Even in the face of these terrifying killing weapons, the Khitans felt no fear. What beehives? They were just trash to the Khitans. But though the Khitans reacted quickly, those on the walls reacted even more quickly. With the turning of gears, arrows emerged from the numerous holes of the beehives. The sharp tips pointed at the charging Khitan warriors. Boom! 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 Before the Khitan warriors could charge very far, countless concentrated arrows poured out, covering every inch in front of the walls. Only those who had experienced it for themselves could understand the true power of the beehives. The arrows blotted out the sky like dark clouds, a piercing whistle tearing through the air. Go! But in the face of this full-out barrage, none of the Khitan warriors fell back. Bang! A Khitan warrior raised up his shield of stellar energy to block the downpour of arrows. At the same time, he wound a rope around his right wrist and pulled, using the momentum to mount the walls and send his saber slicing at the nearest beehive. The Khitan soldiers were all brimming with strength, and this slash of his could have easily shattered a boulder, let alone the beehive and its complicated internal mechanisms. He was confident that he could slice the beehive in half and turn it into a pile of scrap. But when the arrows made impact, what happened was far different from what he had imagined. Whoosh! As the arrows made impact, the sharp tips glinted with a strange light as they somehow pierced through the giant shield of stellar energy. Before the Khitan warrior could react, plush plush, all of the arrows pierced through the stellar energy shield and into his body. Blood gushed out through the numerous wounds, carrying away his life. How could this be? What arrows are these that not even the stellar energy of the Khitans can stop? The Khitan warrior's eyes widened in disbelief as all the strength left him. His body went limp, and as his body fell from the walls, his vision went dark. Thud, thud, thud. He did not come crashing to the ground alone. Those agile Khitan warriors who had been climbing the walls like monkeys were instantly turned into corpses and made to plummet into the sea of fire. Armor-piercing arrows. Armor-piercing arrows. They used armor-piercing metal for the arrows. A fearful cry tore through the battlefield. Though the beehives were powerful, their flaw was that their arrows were short, weak, and short-ranged, not comparable to a strong bow. Thus, they could only damage warhorses and weaker soldiers. Normal soldiers had powerful stellar energy and wore thick armor, which should have been enough to greatly reduce the damage of the beehives. But contrary to everyone's expectations, the Great Tang had crafted these arrows from armor-piercing metal. Though these arrows did not appear like regular armor-piercing arrows, from their luster, it appeared that they were at least 50% armor-piercing metal. The Khitans hated using armor, and at such close quarters this sort of habit was fatal. Ah! Screams tore through the air as the pincushioned Khitans fell from the walls. One strike. Only one strike. The more than 7,000 Khitans and their reinforcements had been instantly slain. There was not a single survivor to be found. Silence. Deathly silence. The soldiers of the Alliance army were left with their mouths agape, their eyes wide open. In the distance, the Khitan king's body went cold, his face pale. This had come too suddenly. The Khitan king began to tremble. He seemingly did not dare to believe that so many of his pugnacious Khitan braves had been killed in just a single engagement. They had yet to even properly fight, and had not gained any of the glory or honor a warrior deserved, only died a meaningless death on the battlefield. The Khitans were not as large as the other countries, and this loss of nearly 1/10 of his forces had the Khitan king stricken with grief. The others around the Khitan king were even more shocked. Gao Shang had ceased to wave his fan, and stared speechlessly at the battlefield. Armor-piercing arrows. No one had expected the Great Tang to be so extravagant and use this sort of expensive material on the beehives. Each beehive could launch 60 or more arrows, even as many as 100. If all these beehives had been equipped with armor-piercing arrows, just how much armor-piercing steel would be required? How many tens of thousands of taels of gold was this? Truly, using gold like it was dirt. In that single wave, Wang Chong had used at least 70 million taels of gold, and this had been only one volley. Madman! Xianxia muttered in shock. There was no other word that could describe what they were all feeling. There was no one else in the world besides Wang Chong capable of such a thing. Besides shock and curses, there was also another, more complicated feeling. Too frightening. He has to die if we want to conquer the Great Tang. Elsewhere, Cui Chenyo's eyes flashed with apprehension. He had always feared Wang Chong's martial arts, especially after what had happened during the Feast of All Countries, where all of them, including his master and Lushan, had almost died to Wang Chong in the northeast corner of the capital. Only on the battlefield did Cui Chenyu realize that Wang Chong's grasp of strategy was even more frightening than his martial arts. He was called the War Saint and had a divine grasp of strategy. With each operation, he would carefully balance the pros and cons, but besides caution, his plans also did not lack for madness. Only the most insane of madmen would use 70 million taels of gold to produce beehive arrows. However, Wang Chong had to consider that when the calamity arrived, all gold left in the treasury would be nothing more than scrap metal. Rather than letting it go to waste, it would be better to exchange it for weapons to increase his chances of victory. In this aspect, it was completely in line with Wang Chong's style, and what seemed insane was actually rational. Boom boom boom. Meanwhile, yet another volley fired, and all the Khitan soldiers within 5,000 feet of the walls, including their reinforcements, were slain to the last man. Even the tree trunks the Khitans had thrown onto the sea of flames were pincushioned with arrows. At this point in the battle, the Alliance army had lost at least 300,000 men. The battlefield was covered in bodies, but the assault on the city had yet to even begin. Although the Great Tang's steel fortress was right in front of them, it seemed as if some invisible barrier stood in their way. The Great Tang's layer after layer of attacks had turned that region into a zone of death. A booming and cold voice came from the depths of the fortress. And Lushan, Osmish Kagan, Khitan King, Shi Queen, Yun Gaisaman, is that all you're capable of? This king still has 700,000 soldiers that have yet to act. To try and rebel against the Great Tang with this little ability, is that not laughable? All of the sovereigns turned ashen upon hearing Wang Chong's voice. Although they knew that Wang Chong's words were meant to damage the morale of the Alliance army, they could not help but be enraged. Bastard! The Khitan king clenched his fists so hard that they audibly cracked. His Khitan soldiers had suffered grievous losses, and there was no doubt that Wang Chong was mocking him. Attend me! This king will kill that bastard personally. The Khitan king's eyes were red with rage, his body trembling. More than 8,000 Khitan soldiers had died without even killing a single enemy. This was not how Khitan braves should have died. Khitan king, calm yourself. Don't take that boy's bait. He's hoping for you to personally take action. A voice came from the side, urging the Chitin King to stop. Surprisingly, it was Lushan who had spoken at this time. In this war, it was Yuzhou that had lost the most soldiers. The underworld cavalry had been almost completely wiped out. But at this time, Lushan was unexpectedly the most rational. Gao Shang looked over at the Chitin King and said, "Correct, Chitin King. If you take action, you will truly have fallen for his trap." The Chitin King and his Chitin warriors were extremely fierce and brave, and they would be very useful in the other parts of the battle. They could not be so easily thrown away here. "So you're saying that we should just let that bastard continue to act cocky?" Yun Gaisaman stepped forward, his eyes narrowing. "Your Majesty, please wait. Let me think." Gao Shang dropped his head, a pensive look in his eyes. All fell silent as Lushan, Yun Gaisaman, Xianxia, and even the furious Chitin King turned to look at him. Gao Shang had been very inconspicuous, not interacting much with the other sovereigns, but everyone knew that Lushan had his current status, had been able to bring Zhang Shogui down, precisely because of this seemingly weak Gao Shang and his far-sighted strategies. A few moments later, Gao Shang finally raised his head and spoke to the sovereigns. "Everyone, I have a way to deal with this steel fortress, but I will need your cooperation." Boom! A plaintive horn blared, and the Alliance army began to surge once more. The battle was restarting much more quickly than had been anticipated. These scoundrels still haven't given up. Within the fortress, beneath the giant banner, Wuxia slightly frowned. Wang Chong looked ahead and coldly said, "They will not give up, nor can they give up. When rowing a boat upstream, you fall back if you stop moving forward. With the cold wave coming, they have nowhere to retreat." Ever since the 40,000 infantry had withdrawn into the fortress and the city assault had begun, the commanders had withdrawn into the fortress. They were generals, so their most important duty was not to fight with the vanguard but to oversee the overall battlefield situation. Now that the battle had begun, the two of them no longer needed to be at the front. "Wang Chong, do you think that they can break through your defenses?" Wuxia questioned. After working together several times, he was extremely confident in Wang Chong's abilities. Each of Wang Chong's defenses reaped more lives when they were triggered. For the Alliance army to attack at this time was simply suicidal. "We can't get careless." Wang Chong shook his head and solemnly said, "Although Yuzhou doesn't have any renowned generals, they cannot be underestimated." Wang Chong had never underestimated any of his opponents. Even when killing chickens, he would use the bull knife. The Yuzhou commanders, whether it was Cui Qianyu, Tianqingxi, Tianqianjin, Zhao Ken, Baizhen Tuoyuo, or Gao Shang, were all basically unknown in the Great Tang and the wider world. This was why Wuxia had asked the question. But Wang Chong knew that none of these people were mediocre. A lack of reputation did not mean a lack of strength. In his last life, Lushan had led these men in sweeping unstoppably through the world, bringing calamity to the people and breaking apart the Great Tang. If they had been lacking strength, they would have never been able to do this. In truth, during the calamity, many great generals had failed to do anything to them, even died to them. This was proof enough of their power. Cui Qianyu, Tianqianjin, and Tianqingxi had another title that they were known by: Demon Stars, Demon Generals. Gao Shang, Cui Qianyu, Tianqingxi, and Tianqianjin were the four demon generals of the apocalypse. And Gao Shang, even though he was a scholar, was ranked above Cui Qianyu and the other generals. Without this man, many things would not have taken place. If my guess is right, the Yuzhou side has already found a solution, Wang Chong said, but his face did not seem very perturbed. While kerosene was very flammable, it was not impossible to deal with. As for the beehives, they were just a kind of weapon. Given the abilities on the Yuzhou side, they would find a solution eventually. Wang Chong was actually rather curious to see what their solution would be. "Zhang Ke, how long until Lord Zhangzhou arrives?" Wang Chong suddenly said. There was one other matter that Wang Chong was extremely concerned about. "Your Highness, they will be here in another 8 to 10 hours, Zhang Ke said. "And what is the progress on the storm plan?" Wang Chong said, placing his hands behind his back. "Your Highness, Xue Qianjun has sent a letter that everything is ready and that they will arrive on time. In addition, the Lord Junior Guardian is also ready and is waiting for your Highness's order. Zhang Ke lowered his head and bowed. Very good. Wang Chong gave a slight nod. Proceed according to the plan. During this brief conversation, the horns blared and drums boomed. The army once more began to approach, but at a much slower pace this time. 7,000 feet, 6,000 feet, 5,000 feet. The distance rapidly shrank, and the Alliance army once more entered the Great Tang's attack range. At this moment, bang! A thunderous boom came from overhead, and a completely frozen sheep plummeted from the sky like a boulder and smashed into the ground in front of the army. The impact caused snow and kerosene to splash out, and the frozen sheep caused the force of the fire to somewhat diminish. Boom! 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 More and more frozen sheep hurtled out of the sky and smashed into the sea of fire. Plush! 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 Arrows howled out, but the interception of the arrows was not as useful this time. The frozen sheep did not crumble apart like the boulders, instead continuing their descent into the ground. Sensing this, Wang Chong slightly frowned. Not even Wang Chong had thought about using sheep to replace rocks. If he recalled correctly, the Alliance was facing a food shortage. If his guess was right, this strange tactic was probably the work of Gao Shang. What a problem! I really should have killed him. As Wang Chong listened, he couldn't help but sigh. Meanwhile, frozen sheep continued to crash down, and the blazing flames continued to dwindle. Bang! The dense ranks of the Alliance army erupted with cheers, their spirits rising. Then, without the slightest hesitation, the soldiers began to charge across the bodies of the sheep. The greatest obstacle to the assault on the city was the sea of fire. Once the flames were extinguished, not even those frightening beehives were much of an obstacle. The countless soldiers bellowed as they charged out, and at this time an order was sent from the rear. A force of around 8,000 soldiers split off and began to dig trenches on the edge of the battlefield, and channels that would guide the black kerosene into the trenches. As a liquid, kerosene had a certain fluidity to it. If they could divert the kerosene, they could suppress the Great Tang's kerosene tactic. More and more livestock continued to rain down, and with the channels guiding away the kerosene, the blazing fire outside the fortress finally showed signs of extinguishing. Raise shields! In front of the army was a large concentration of shield soldiers. In the distance, the siege towers had seemingly lost their apprehensions and were beginning to rumble forward. Cack-lack! On the walls, gears clicked as the tens of thousands of beehives prepared to fire. With a deafening howl, a terrifying downpour of arrows descended upon the Alliance army. But the same attack had a completely different effect this time. Swoosh, swoosh, swoosh. Arrows pierced through heavy shields, stabbing into the shoulders and chests of the Alliance soldiers beneath them. But these Alliance soldiers simply roared and madly charged forward. In the back, a Gogrian soldier without any sort of cover kicked one of the sheep corpses on the ground into the air. This sheep corpse failed to block the rain of arrows, but it did sharply reduce its speed. The Gogrian soldier kicked up several more sheep and then continued his charge. The reason Gao Shang had used the bodies of livestock in place of stone immediately became apparent. The frozen livestock could not only suppress the flames, they could also serve as meat shields for the army. Clang, clang, clang. Many soldiers fell, but even more managed to successfully reach the walls. At the walls, these tens of thousands of soldiers threw up the ropes in their hands, the hooks howling through the air before latching onto the walls. These soldiers swiftly began to scale the walls. As these soldiers began to climb, above them, about 30 to 40 meters from the ground, a massive boom could be heard. A moment later, a giant ballista bolt shot out like a furious dragon toward one of the siege towers. Ah! Cries of alarms and screams rang out as a hole 2 to 3 meters in diameter was punched through the center of the siege tower, with several Alliance soldiers being blasted out through the hole. Careful! Hurry and repair the siege tower! Panicked voices came from the top of the siege tower. Though the siege tower had avoided the fate of collapse, everyone knew that the siege tower would not be able to take another such attack. Moreover, The structure of the siege tower had been badly damaged and the entire edifice was swaying. One Alliance soldier even fell from the top. Assault the city! A nearby siege tower sensed that it was in danger and preemptively ordered the assault. Long, box-shaped mechanisms at the roof the siege tower activated, and two giant claws attached to ropes shot out and latched onto the top of the wall. Alliance soldiers jumped out and began to move along the ropes toward the wall. Charge! Kyle! All the soldiers seemed to go crazy as they bellowed. So many of them had died without reaching the wall before, but this time, they all saw daybreak, a faint sliver of hope. No, this was not just a sliver of hope, but a real chance of overcoming the walls. More and more soldiers charged, more and more men gathering beneath the walls. Bang, bang, bang. Long siege ladders swiftly moved across the ground, and they were quickly raised and brought to lean against the steel walls. The walls had been covered in a thin layer of ice, making them much smoother than expected. Several of the siege ladders began to slip to the side upon placement, but more soldiers quickly gathered to support the ladders. Go! With war cries, the Alliance soldiers began to climb the ladders up the walls. Boom, boom, boom. Furious explosions and red light filled the skies as flames began to blaze in the skies once more. The Great Tang had once more begun to launch its kerosene bombs, but this time, the Alliance army was able to intercept them while they were high in the air. Ha ha ha! Good! The Khitan king heartily laughed at this sight. This is true war. The Khitans did not fear battle, nor did they fear death. But that way of death had been far too depressing. But everything had changed now, and the battle was beginning to lean toward the Alliance side. All soldiers, hear my order. Full offensive. Prepare to break the walls. Goguryeo Emperor Yun Gaesaman coldly laughed as he swiftly gave his orders. And Lushan said nothing, but a faint smile appeared on his face. The one who laughed last laughed best. Although Wang Chong had killed 300,000 soldiers at the start of the battle, so long as he could break through the walls and annihilate the Great Tang, he wouldn't have cared if even more soldiers had died. Xianxia, you go as well. And Lushan suddenly ordered. Yes. Xianxia bowed from atop his horse and immediately rode off. Thwish, thwish, thwish. Piercing and fear-inducing whistling came from the front as the beehives deluged the battlefield with their arrows. With every passing moment, large numbers of Alliance soldiers died. But compared to before, the Alliance army now had ways to defend. No longer would they have to stand around and wait for death. Losses were inevitable in battle. These losses were entirely acceptable to the Alliance. Today is the day to make your name and become a noble. The king has decreed that the first to reach the walls will be richly rewarded. Army supervisors watch from the rear. The Punisher squad has already been mobilized. Execute all those who retreat. Charging forward is your only path of survival. Cries and bellows rang out through the battlefield. Ropes, siege ladders. The soldiers of the Alliance used various methods to climb the walls, with some soldiers even climbing up using the beehives protruding from the walls. Clang! An officer swung his saber, and in a flash of sparks, his stellar energy-infused saber left a long scar on the beehives. With a clack, the beehive that had been about to unleash another downpour of arrows froze. Beehives were made from refined iron and reinforced with inscriptions, but it wasn't like they were made of meteoric metal. When encountering powerful weapons or techniques, they would still end up being destroyed. More and more soldiers continued to surge up the walls, and though they encountered various obstacles, they continued their frenzied charge. Ha ha ha! I'm finally on the walls. I am the first. A soldier jumped and quickly landed at the top of the walls, and behind him, hundreds of soldiers braved the volley of arrows to join him. The thin sheet of fragile ice, the curved steel walls, and the beehive volleys. To climb these walls that were more than 70 meters high took a great deal of effort, but even so, they had finally succeeded. But a moment later, that cheering soldier spotted what was behind the walls and instantly froze. The eyes of the Yuzhou, Eastern Turkic, Gogrian, Shi, and Khitan soldiers all flew open in fear. While assaulting the city, they had not been suffering from very strong resistance, and they had not seen any Tang soldiers on the walls. the master archers having withdrawn into the fortress some time ago. But now they finally understood why. Stationed within the walls was an army of nearly 200,000 Tang soldiers. All of these armored Tang soldiers glared at them with cold eyes, none of them making a sound. Farther in, several thousand master archers stood in neat ranks, their countless arrows aimed at the soldiers on the walls. This terrifying sight made the hearts of the Alliance soldiers freeze. Before they could react, bowstrings twanged and a rain of arrows arrived. The sharp, armor-piercing heads easily pierced through their armor and penetrated into their hearts or foreheads. Without even a groan, these Alliance soldiers went limp and dropped from the walls. Meanwhile, the heavy infantry lying in wait behind the walls did not move. They were still waiting for even more soldiers to gather on the walls. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. When the count reached 8, a roar like that of a furious lion rang out. The Tang soldiers split up into teams of 6 and charged up the walls. Swoosh, swoosh, swoosh. Halos and stellar energy resonated, and in a flash, the sound of weapons slicing and stabbing into flesh could be heard. Alliance soldiers were swiftly slain on the spot, their bodies pushed off the walls. The Tang soldiers lying in wait far outnumbered the Alliance soldiers who had just mounted the walls. More importantly, whether it was the Yuzhou, Eastern Turkic, or Gogrian soldiers, none of them could take up formation in this city assault. All of them were fighting on their own. But this was certainly not the case for the Tang soldiers. This was a division of 100,000 soldiers that Wang Chong had trained specifically for city defense. Before the start of this war, Wang Chong had worked together with Xianxia Jianxiong to train this division. In addition, he had Zhang Shouji erect a model fortress and divided this division into 2 groups that constantly trained against each other in this environment. The 6-man teams were the unique weapon utilized by this city defense division. These 6 soldiers attacked and defended together, sharing a tacit understanding. Moreover, their teamwork created a result where 1 + 1 was greater than 2. When fighting on the walls, these teams seemed capable of fighting against 6 times their number. Kill! Plush! 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 War cries rang out, and the sound of slicing weapons came from various points along the wall. Now that this city defense division had joined the battle, it did not matter how many Alliance soldiers mounted the walls. In an extremely short amount of time, they would be cleanly and swiftly cut down. And this was far from the only development on the battlefield. Boom boom boom. Countless giant caltrops once more began to descend, and not even the Alliance army had a way to deal with this sort of heavy weaponry. The master archers had no way of intercepting these giant caltrops. Ah! Screams tore through the air as the caltrops crushed and punctured countless Alliance soldiers, leaving behind crimson trails of gore. One of the caltrops even managed to strike a siege tower. Boom! It was the top of the siege tower that had been struck, and as debris flew everywhere, the ropes that fixed the siege tower to the top of the walls snapped. Kill! But the Great Tang's offensive could not stop the Alliance. The numerous deaths seemed to only spur the Alliance army into further madness. Countless soldiers savagely roared, their combined voices sounding like a giant wave. Clang, clang, clang. More and more metal hooks were thrown onto the walls, and more siege ladders were placed down. With each passing moment, tens of thousands of soldiers were climbing up the walls. Boom! On the western side of the battlefield, a massive siege tower finally reached the walls. Boom! A hooked metal plate that was nearly 7 meters long came crashing down, instantly creating a path that was around for meters wide and led directly to the walls. Bang! A sound wave that was infused with killing intent came from within the siege tower. Several dozen Alliance soldiers charged onto the walls like bees leaving their hive. There were Gogurians, Khitans, and Yuzhou soldiers present in this group, all of them working together with silent understanding as they attacked the Tang soldiers. Cree! Amidst all this fighting, few people noticed the sharp screech of a bird coming from the steel fortress. Before the Alliance soldiers could react, an agile bird flew past the walls. Behind this bird, the sky suddenly darkened. Tens of thousands of eagles and other birds flapped their wings and flew toward the Alliance army. The Alliance army was struck dumb by this sight. A sharp-eyed Gogrian soldier on the ground instantly noticed something strange about these birds. "Watch out! They've got something in their feet." Countless Alliance soldiers looked up at the claws of these birds. They saw that these birds were holding some sort of ball in their claws. A moment later, one of the birds let go, and a heavy ball descended from the sky. More and more birds began to drop these strange balls. Bang! These balls were more fragile than they seemed. The moment one hit the ground, it burst into shards, and a black liquid splashed everywhere. Kerosene! It's kerosene! The Alliance soldiers almost stopped breathing at this sight, their pupils constricting. Panic instantly spread through the army. Delish! 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 The Alliance army's archers quickly changed targets, and volleys of arrows instantly wiped out thousands of birds. But none of this could alter the situation on the battlefield. As the tens of thousands of birds flew over, a deafening rumble came from the steel fortress. Boom! 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 At a point 20-some meters from the top of the walls, metal plates thrust out horizontally in 2s and 3s. Ah! The Alliance soldiers climbing the siege ladders cried out in alarm as the enormous impact of the metal plates pushed away or imbalanced the siege ladders. Some of the siege ladders even fell backward into the dense ranks of the army below. Whoosh! As the siege ladders were pushed away, thousands of metal pipes appeared under the row of metal plates, extending out of the wall. Black, viscous liquid gushed out of the pipes, drenching the Alliance soldiers down below. Farther down, a metal plate moved aside, revealing a dense collection of holes. These were also metal pipes, but much shorter and wider. Soon, large amounts of kerosene began to gush out of these pipes. Whoosh! The gushing kerosene suddenly turned into blazing flames, swiftly igniting the battlefield. Ag! Miserable screams resounded through the battlefield as countless soldiers were set aflame and rolled on the ground in pain. The pipes extending from the walls had been Zhang Shouji's handiwork. Using special mechanisms, they were able to produce enormous force. The kerosene and flames gushing out of these pipes could reach as far as 50 meters, and they soon turned the area beneath the walls into a sea of flames. The kerosene bombs were easily targeted by the enemy, so Wang Chong had developed this close-range killing method. Not even master archers could do anything against this gushing kerosene. Tens of thousands of Alliance soldiers were rapidly drained of their stellar energy and were ultimately burned to death by the kerosene. Not only that, Wang Chong had spread large amounts of kerosene over the battlefield via his birds, and this kerosene was also set aflame. The high temperature of the kerosene flames turned the metal siege ladders bright red, and some of the ladders even began to melt. Bastard! The Alliance generals turned ashen and gnashed their teeth. Kerosene was not a product of the Central Plains, but of Arabia to the west. However, Wang Chong used it far more effectively than the Arabs ever had. The Great Tang's army was primarily infantry, and the restricted terrain infantry favored was far more effective for kerosene than the spacious areas Arab cavalry needed for their charges. Let this lowly woman deal with this. A waft of fragrant aroma blew through the area as a crisp and melodious voice rang out. In the middle of the army, behind An Lushan, the charming She Queen stepped forward, her eyes gleaming. Her alluring eyes were fixed on the battlefield. The fire was much stronger than anticipated, the tongues of flame that reached more than 10 meters into the air terrifying to behold. Kerosene wasn't actually as lethal as the beehives or the ballistae, but the sea of fire represented a fatal obstacle to the Alliance. If they did not find a way to deal with this kerosene tactic, the Alliance would be perpetually stuck in a hard-pressed state. The Queen of the She. Everyone else was surprised to see this queen volunteering. She Queen. This Arabian kerosene is hard to extinguish with sand and continues to burn when encountering water. Do you have some way to deal with it? Goguryeo Emperor Yun Gaesaman curiously turned to the She Queen. Although Goguryeo was not far from the She and the Khitans, Yun Gaesaman's army had always been doing battle with the Great Tang. His interactions with these two tribes were rare. Regarding the She Queen, Yun Gaesaman only knew that she had a fierce and brave personality that could compare to a man's, but little else. The She tribe's wars had rarely been so dire as to require the She Queen's personal intervention. This lowly woman might not be able to compare to the rest of you when it comes to fighting. But there is probably no one except me who can deal with this sea of flames. The she-queen lightly stepped forward and flashed a smile at Yun Geiseman, an enchanting smile that could sway anyone's heart. But Yun Geiseman and the other sovereigns felt their hearts shiver as they averted their gazes. While the she-queen was a rather unknown figure, Yun Geiseman and Osmishkagan knew of her ferocity. As someone who could stand out amongst the she, where the strong ate the weak, and could contend against the Khitan king, the she-queen was not merely a pretty face. Anyone who regarded her as an ordinary woman and had harbored evil thoughts was probably nothing but bones and dust by now. I am not doubting your strength, but the battle has just begun, and the Great Tang has yet to send out any of its great generals. Is it not inappropriate to waste stellar energy at this time? The Khitan king suddenly ventured. While the Khitan was strong and fierce, he wasn't stupid. At this stage in the battle, the Great Tang had only used some mechanical weapons and lower-class soldiers. The elite armies had yet to appear, let alone any brigadier generals or great generals. It wasn't as if the Khitan king hated fighting. In fact, the Khitan king wanted nothing more than to charge to the front line with his generals and commence a massacre. With his abilities, there were few in the Great Tang who could contend against him. But if he consumed too much stellar energy and fell into some trap, the results would be unthinkable. This was why all of them watched from the rear and chose their moments carefully. Soldiers versus soldiers and generals versus generals. While the enemy generals had yet to sortie, they had to remain cautious. This was a sort of unwritten law of the battlefield. If the she-queen went to the front lines and something happened to her, the she-tribe would fall apart. Relax. I'll be careful and not get too close. In addition, Khitan king, if the enemy's chief commander takes action, this lowly woman will rely on you to respond. The she-queen shot him a flirtatious glance, and Lu Shan coldly looked on. Rather than saying anything, he shot a glance at Gao Shang. Everyone saw this, and the area fell silent as everyone turned to Gao Shang. In this war, other than the exact execution, the general strategies and tactics were entirely under Gao Shang's command. This was something that all the countries had agreed on before agreeing to the alliance. In other words, Gao Shang was the military strategist for the alliance. If the she-queen wanted to go to the front, she needed Gao Shang's approval. If this risk was too great and Gao Shang refused, even the she-queen would have to obey and put aside the idea. Gao Shang frowned in thought for a few moments, and he swiftly made his decision. Let her go. She-queen, I leave the front line to you, but you must remember that you cannot get within 400 feet of the walls. In addition, you cannot stay for more than 5 minutes, and if the enemy commander appears, you are to immediately withdraw. You cannot stay and fight. Understood? My little strategist. With a relaxed smile, the she-queen took her leave. As she passed Gao Shang, she lightly brushed her fingers against him. Gao Shang turned nervous and instinctively stepped back. But by this time, the she-queen had already turned into a gust of wind. Her voice came from the distance. Black Dragon King, when the time comes, this lowly woman will require your assistance. Her voice lingered in the air. The battle continued. Kerosene continued to gush out of the walls. Experts from the Alliance would occasionally fly into the air and use various methods to block the pipes. Stopping them up, cutting at them with weapons, or bending the pipes. But this could not revert the damage done to the offensive. Cree. Suddenly, a sharp whistle came from the edge of the battlefield, penetrating through the clouds. This sound drowned out all other sounds on the battlefield. The thundering of hooves, the howling of the winds, and even the screams of the dying. Bang! With a mighty boom, the she-queen appeared at a distance of some 7,000 feet from the fortress. She was dressed in opulent attire, and her arms were spread apart. Behind her, a seething mist of ice and snow was coming, heading straight for the steel fortress. The icy mist seemed ready to engulf the world. Rumble! The Tang soldiers on the walls watched in shock as the surging and roaring blizzard engulfed the she-queen. The cold wave and icy mist continued to hurtle toward the fortress. In a flash, seething snow and ice filled the world, and there was nothing left to be seen on the battlefield. Even the blazing flames of the Sea of Fire had been obscured by the blizzard. From the walls of the fortress, it appeared as if the entire world had fallen into turmoil, everything past a distance of 3 feet turning into a blur. The blizzard and icy mist spread with incredible speed, not just affecting the battlefield outside the walls, but also within the fortress. The visibility in the region plunged. What's going on? What happened? The soldiers of the City Defense Division on the walls began to panic. The City Defense Division was divided into 6-man teams, and cooperation was the foundation of this division. They had trained to rely on each other, but now the members of each team could no longer see each other. Even when they tried their best to draw close, they could only make out indistinct silhouettes. What's going on? Is it an Lushan? In the center of the fortress, Abusi, Chuluwu, and many other generals stood up in alarm as they watched icy mist overtake the battlefield. It was their belief that only one person on the enemy side could control the weather. And Lushan. But hadn't Wang Chong already neutralized and Lushan's weather-controlling ability? Had something changed? Abusi instinctively turned to Wang Chong. Though the mist was thick, it had little effect on a great general like Abusi. No, this isn't a weather-controlling ability. Wang Chong shook his head, his eyes also on the battlefield. This current situation was very similar to a weather-controlling ability, but as Wang Chong spread out his psychic energy over the battlefield, he noticed something different. Wang Chong quickly noticed a unique energy on the battlefield. This is a martial art. The She Queen's ability. Wang Chong had never fought or interacted with the She Queen before, and the She Queen's strength was not obvious. But Wang Chong had still managed to recognize it at a glance. In the apocalyptic era, and Lushan's rebellion had drawn the attention of the world. Moreover, the She Queen was a woman, so there had been many rumors about her. Truly surprising. I didn't think the leader of the She tribe would possess such extraordinary cultivation. Wang Chong smirked. The She Queen's ability was rather similar to his divine embryo 3. But at this present stage, Wang Chong was not prepared to so quickly intervene and personally deal with her. Chulu, I leave the She Queen to you. Wang Chong suddenly turned to the deputy commander of the Tongluo cavalry. Chulu. Yes. Chulu's expression turned grim as he lowered his head and respectfully left. Back at the Battle of Talas, Chulu had been proud and unruly, and Wang Chong had barely any command over him. But after the Tongluo tribe narrowly escaped death after the rebellion of the 3 princes, avoiding the fate of being completely wiped out with the rest of the first prince's army, Chulu's attitude experienced a complete reversal, and he treated Wang Chong with utmost respect and admiration. This was even more true now that Wang Chong was ascendant and was now the supreme figure of the Great Tang. The strong ate the weak, and the victor was king. This was the Tongluo's principle. Wang Chong had used strength to crush the Tongluo and was the war saint revered by the world. Now that the times had changed, so, naturally had the Tongluo tribe's attitude to Wang Chong. Without hesitation, Chulu turned to leave. He walked only a few steps before Wang Chong called out to him, "Wait! This ritual tool is for you. Use it against the She Queen." As Wang Chong spoke, he took a long bundle from Old Eagle's back and tore off the covering, revealing a dazzling, golden object. Chulu's eyes widened when he saw the object in Wang Chong's hand, his face paling. In Wang Chong's hands was an extremely ancient and elegant golden bow. It was more than 5 feet long and covered in intricate patterns. Inscriptions. Chulu could tell at a glance that these were extremely powerful and old inscriptions. He also saw many reliefs made of darker metal on the bow. These reliefs were of the legendary 72 demon god pillars of Arabia. Black waves surged beneath the feet of these demon gods as they thrust out their palms and roared at the heavens. This was clearly the scene of the 72 demon god pillars being suppressed by God beneath the sea. The demon god bow. This was a powerful ritual tool that Wang Chong had obtained from the Arabian treasury. Wang Chong had owned this bow for some time, but he was no master archer. However, Chulu was different. For the Tongluo, horse archery was a fundamental skill, and Chulu was a standout in his tribe. "Many thanks, Your Highness." Chuluwu grabbed the demon god bow and left. A cold voice rang out over the battlefield. She-Queen, I will count to 3. This king is giving you time to leave. But if you do not, this king will be merciless. The battlefield fell silent, the snowstorm dwindling in strength. Wang Chong and Lushan, Gao Shang, Osmishkagan, and the others instantly recognized the voice. In front of the steel fortress, the She-Queen was taken aback and instinctively looked up at the walls. But a moment later, the She-Queen stroked her cheeks and charmingly smiled. Your Highness, what is this? Are you personally taking action against this lowly woman? And Lushan and the Khitan King couldn't help but frown at this reply. This was the battlefield where one died and the other lived. Did the She-Queen not understand the situation? There's nothing to be done. That's just how she is. The Khitan King helplessly spread out his arms. Wang Chong spoke once more. I'm not needed to deal with you. Is that so? The She-Queen was surprised at first, but the reply only made her even more eager. Wang Chong ignored her and began the countdown. 3, 2, 1. Wang Chong's icy voice rang out through the world. The She-Queen had not expected Wang Chong to be so straightforward, but his indifferent voice provoked her pride. The She-Queen clenched her silver teeth and viciously said, Humph. The more you're like this, the more I want to see what you're going to try. If Wang Chong personally intervened, she might have been afraid, but she wasn't afraid of some lackey. The She-Queen might have been a woman, but not just anybody could sit on the throne of the She tribe and become one of the powerhouses of the Northeast. That bastard was looking down on her too much. Humph! The She-Queen did not move, and a cold grunt came from within the fortress. Inside the steel fortress, Wang Chong's expression chilled as he slowly raised his hand into the air. His hand trembled, and then, suddenly, boom! The earth trembled as a tornado howled out. Before anyone could react, the blizzard stirred up by the She-Queen was obliterated. The thick and lingering icy mist rapidly dispersed. Clarity was restored to the battlefield, and it once more became possible to see what was going on in front of the steel fortress. The Great Tang's kerosene had created a sea of flames in front of the walls, but after the She-Queen's move, all of the flames had been extinguished. Not only that, the kerosene that had drenched the ground had now been sealed under a thick layer of ice, together with the bodies and various pieces of equipment. Meanwhile, a thick layer of ice had also sealed off the beehives, the steel pipes, and the metal plates that had pushed off the siege ladders. Rumble! A metallic clatter came from the walls, but the beehives and steel pipes could no longer function, let alone unleash their lethal cargo. The soldiers operating the switches within the wall paled. The She-Queen smugly smiled. The She tribe survived in a similar state as the Khitans. During the winter, their lands became engulfed in snow, and the temperature in the lands of the She and Khitans would plunge. The She-Queen's lineage had developed this ability through training in this environment. I'd like to see what you have to deal with me. The She-Queen looked at the steel fortress and smiled. Although she had boasted in front of An Lushan and the others, she was actually an extremely cautious person. Let alone the limit of 400 feet Gao Shang had placed. The She-Queen was standing more than 7,000 feet away. Even if Wang Chong personally took action, she had enough time to flee, let alone someone else. Bang! The She-Queen's smile was still hanging on her lips when a thunderous boom came from the fortress. At the same time, a boundless energy appeared in everyone's senses. It was so powerful that even ordinary soldiers could sense it. Whoosh! Wind began to howl, but this time, it was coming from the direction of the steel fortress and moving toward Yuzhou. Not good. The She-Queen paled, instantly sensing that her life was in grave danger. Her young and beautiful face instantly went as white as paper. Driven by terror and instinct, the She-Queen lunged to the side. But compared to that arrow unleashed by Chuluwu from within the fortress, she was far too slow. Plush! An indistinct blur shot out of the skies, piercing through space and straight at the She-Queen. The She-Queen dodged almost instinctively, but suddenly, she felt a piercing pain at her back, and the sound of an arrow penetrating through flesh entered her ears.